Hi and welcome. This week I'm talking with Steve Lamb about his passion for Moto Guzzis and in particular his most recent acquisition, a beautiful Mark I 850 Le Mans. Unfortunately, because of prior commitments, we were unable to film the Le Mans in action. However, I plan to do so sometime in the future. I hope you enjoy Steve's story. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
So how did you get into motorcycling originally?
My uncle and my cousins, he owned a plumbing business, and that still exists, and he had bought them trail bike, and we became interested. We built my brother and I built a go-kart of sorts, and then we said, oh, motorbikes, you know, our cousins have got those, oh, we'd like to get into that. And they were riding around on the old Honda SL70s in those days, which were, you know, really pretty new. But we couldn't afford to get them, so we were actually borrowing our cousin's bike, which caused a bit of a problem because they were well known for throwing chains, and at the time we had it, threw a chain and blew the gearbox, which didn't go down too well with our cousins. And then after that, it was just moving on to other like XR75s. My brother was built race. We used to race out of Broadford. He built a bike which ran on methanol. Went pretty quick, but pretty fragile.
Was that a XR?
XR75, yep. Very collectible these days, I noticed. They go for a lot of money. And then from there it was just, you just moved. I did trail bike riding, we moved to Glen Waverley, and there wasn't the land available, but we still found places to ride. I moved on to a CT175 Yamaha, CT1575C, then DT400s, and from there it was just like the XT500 that I had for a while before it got stolen at RMIT when I was going to RMIT. And bought another one, modified that, and then it was just a range of road bikes after that. Z650s, GSX 1100s, quite a range. And then the Guzzis I'd bought in late 70s.
So what attracted you to the Moto Guzzis in particular?
I like the style of the S3, which was pretty much fairly new at that point in time. The Le Mans didn't really exist, or was talked about, but the S3 was about, and the 3 discs, and it was light, and also I'm a short rider.
Oh, and seat height.
Seat height on a Guzzi is an advantage for a short rider. Although I don't have any trouble riding tall bikes. I ride a K100, rode K100 for 20 odd years, and that's a very tall bike and very heavy, very top heavy, but I've never had any trouble riding tall bikes.
Did you have any maintenance issues with the S3, or did you do any modifications to it?
The main maintenance issues with the S3 was, like all those Guzzis in the early days, was the gearbox spring.
Yes, I've done a few of those myself.
That went not long after I got it. So that was a learning job, replacing that. Apart from that, no, it was pretty reliable actually. The main thing was to improve reliability was replacing the stock ignition system with something that was points are good, but there comes a point where you go, I don't want to keep adjusting these things. So in those days, a Piranha ignition system was what most people stuck on. It was pretty much the only thing. Oh, there probably was some British, the Boyer systems and so on were around.
I think it was the Dyna system.
The Dyna system, which is actually what this has got on it. But this has still got the points. It's a Dyna booster, which is
Is that a separate product, is it?
Yeah.
Or I have never heard of that particularly.
It's called the Dyna Booster 2. It's actually just a transistor-assisted ignition, which uses the old system where you keep the points and it just boosts all they do is trigger an output, and away you go.
And the points should last a long time.
The points should last a long time, so the simplicity still remains. The Piranha system that was fitted to the S3 was actually an optical system, which is pretty reliable. I never had any trouble with it. That was probably the only 2 things, apart from the usual stuff with Guzzis, like leaking fork seals and leaking seals in the rear drive. I had a problem with that for a while there until I took it out and actually redressed the rear crown wheel holder. That had got a bit of rust on it, and where the seal ran, it just was cutting out the seal. So eventually I had to fix that, which wasn't a big deal. It just took a bit of work.
Is that the S3 you've still got?
Yes.
You don't part with your bikes easily then, do you?
No, I don't. I tend to keep things that I own. I've still got a lot of cars that I've had for many, many years, and yeah, it's just, you know, I'm running out of space.
Well, I'm glad you can afford to keep everything.
Although there's some bikes I wish I'd kept, like the Le Mans Mark II, which I had for years. I wish I'd kept that, but that's, yeah, that's...
So,
that's
was that your next Moto Guzzi, the Mark II or something?
No, well, there's a bit of a story there. No, the next Guzzi I bought was actually a well, actually I didn't buy it, it was a T4. The T4 was an interesting story in that I had, I'd bought a BMW R100 CS, which was a mistake because that's one of the worst motorcycles I've ever owned in my life, although today they're worth a hell of a lot of money. Anyway, I came to the point where I decided I had enough and I wanted to get another Guzzi, and I still had the S3, but I needed something which is a bit more
day-to-day
friendly. And just out of interest, I advertised if anyone wanted to swap for a Guzzi for a R100 CS, and I got this guy who came around, and yep, he turned up with his T4, and to cut a long story short, we came to a deal, but he went out and blew up the R100 CS, blamed me. It was not a very nice experience, even though, as it turned out, I discovered that the guy who owned it, who bought the R100 from me, had actually gone out and blown it up through his own stupidity, and so that was was not a nice experience.
Maybe we should move on from there to the next Moto Guzzi.
You might want to edit that out. But
that was the Mark II Le Mans, was it? The next one along?
Yeah, that was the Mark II Le Mans, which I bought from a guy who was a policeman actually. He advertised it. Really nice bike to you know, a bit smoother. I think they made a few improvements to the not a huge number, but I think it was a really nice bike to ride, except for the fact that it had a close ratio gearbox, racing gearbox fitted, which had a very, very tall first gear, of course, as they all do, and it was very noisy to ride, whiny, and so on.
So a straight cut then?
Straight cut gearbox. And so not very user friendly around town. And of course, in those days I hadn't had much experience with them, so I thought, you know, you wanted another Guzzi. It was a really nice looking bike. It was very original apart from the, well, I think the gearbox may have been bought as a factory extra. I don't know whether it was swapped in later or not. He didn't know either. But it also had very heavy throttles, and I had just had an accident on an XS 1100. Nothing major, but it had damaged the ligaments in the thumb, and I found it very, very hard to ride after, even for half an hour. The throttles were that heavy; it was becoming a real problem for me. So I decided it was time to move on from that and sold it, and ended up buying another GSX 1100. So, which is, you know.
So you strayed from the fold for a few years then?
Oh, I'd had GSX 1100 for a while. I actually rode a Le Mans at Peter Stevens when they first, Le Mans the Mark III. I rode one of the first ones in the country out at Peter Stevens in Dandenong. And it was just too much to spend. I didn't want to spend that much at that point in time. And the GSX 1100 was there, which is what I was actually looking at. And so I ended up buying that. And they actually are, I've noticed, worth a lot of money too. And so I sort of wish the very first models of those, the E model, is actually worth quite a lot of money now.
Probably not as much as a
Mark II Le Mans, but
or even a Mark II.
Yeah, there you go. But that's just the way it goes. I mean, you know, you make your decisions in life, and you live with it.
You do.
But yeah, I mean, I bought the Mark II. I kept the T4 for a while. Decided that touring wasn't really my thing, and so moved away. Kept the S3, but moved away from Guzzis apart from that. Into other things.
So when did the Mark I Le Mans come along? That's a much more recent purchase.
This is I've only had this for about 3 years. They don't come up very often these days, as you would know. There's a few American ones around I've seen. This is an Australian delivered one,
which should have a bit more value than an
I would have thought
imported.
so. But it's such a narrow market that I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if they took a while to sell, because it's only going to appeal to a very small niche of people.
Older people, let's face it.
Older people generally.
You know,
but they do suit the cafe racer sort of, what do you want to call it, the fad at the moment, where people want to chop these
distinguished gentlemen?
Yes, I wouldn't go that far, but anyway.
I'm thinking of the ride.
Not me, well, with me anyway. But no, I've only had this for about 3 years. I bought it from a guy in South Australia. Actually, I bought it, just based purely on photographs, because the price was, well, let's say closer to 10 than 20, which at the time you just didn't see them, and the photos for that sort of price you just don't see them.
No, well, I will say that even in the last 3 years, the price of all Moto Guzzis, the older ones, has certainly risen significantly more than what you'd expect.
Yeah, which means it's a reflection of demand, I suspect, more than anything else.
Even the Mark 4s and 5s have gone up in value, and yet they were very cheap 5 years ago.
I haven't really kept track of the later ones. I'm more into the 70s, as you've seen. But when I did buy it and get it here, eventually I found quite a few problems with it. Not the least which was the seat, that's actually not the original seat. It's I managed to get that in from Germany as a
Is that a reproduction or?
It's a reproduction, yeah.
So they've done the same moulded over type process.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I've still got the original seat. It's not cracked, but the rear mudguard mounts to it, so it's actually bolted to the bottom of the seat. And the original seat, there's four main bolts that hold it in place, and they're just moulded in nuts, and they've actually come away. So, and it was flopping around, so I decided, no, well, I can have a go at trying to repair it, or just buy a seat and then I'll be able to ride it without having to worry about the rear mudguard falling off. So I did that, and I'll have a go at repairing the original seat when I get the chance. So this replacement actually weighs probably 2.5 times the original.
Really?
Yeah.
It's more heavy duty in the
chunky.
base.
Very chunky.
And other things you've had to do to it?
Well,
the fuel petcoats look fairly new.
They're new. The original ones were badly rusted, and so I will probably eventually try to fix those up. But in the meantime, I actually had a set of petcocks that I picked up. But apart from that, which is relatively minor, the main problems with it, with the brake system, was a mess.
Just from age and corrosion?
Mainly, yeah. The original calipers in these bikes, all these bikes in the 70s, had hard chrome plated pistons in them.
Yes.
Which any water got in there, which happens naturally, they start to corrode. And I actually, on my S3 in the early 80s, I went to go for a ride one Saturday morning, and I got to the end of the driveway. We were living in Nunawading at the time. Applied the front brake, and the front wheel just locked up solid. I had to drag the bike back with the front wheel locked up, and it was purely because the piston had locked up because of the corrosion. But what I found was, with this bike, the owner had spent, I've got receipts for $11,000 worth of work on it, and he gave it to I won't name them, a dealer in South Australia to get it ready for roadworthy to sell, and they supposedly fixed up the brake system. But I found when the one caliper wasn't working at all, and it was given a roadworthy. All the brake hoses were rusted. The fittings on the end corrode. That's quite common, and it was just a mess, a complete mess. So I had to I replaced everything, rebuilt the calipers with the hard anodised aluminium pistons.
Have any trouble getting the calipers apart?
Not getting the pistons out's quite a chore. I use compressed air and a special fitting I make up.
Stood back
a distance, yes. But it does work eventually, and a bit of judicious heating. You've got to be a bit careful with that, because the rubber seal can collapse, and that can cause more problems. But all the hoses, I've tracked down original hoses, which took quite a bit of work from different suppliers because a lot of people would have just gone and put on braided hoses. But I decided that, well,
you wanted to keep
I
it
wanted
original.
to keep it close to original as possible, which I think makes it, personally, I think it looks better. And
it does, and it does keep its value up. I mean, it's amazing how many people have dumped the linked braking system on the early Moto Guzzis, which, if you're not used to it, is quite a fright.
Can get quite a bit of use to. Yeah.
But once you're used to it, it works very well.
It does, yeah. And I'm used to it, and so it doesn't bother me. It's like the rising and the lowering and raising on acceleration and deceleration of the rear end. I don't notice it. But a lot of people...
And the torque reaction, you know, if you gun it through a corner, I don't even notice it.
So basically I've spent a lot of time fixing up things like that, and things like the oil supply to the head and the breathers from the head. I've replaced those with factory parts because they were all, again, everything was corroded. A lot of corroded bolts I've replaced it with stainless steel, which the purists would probably have a heart attack over, but that's just my view. Is
I notice you've still got the original switchgear on it, which doesn't look too bad either.
Yes.
And they have a tendency to
I've
not
actually
last
got,
well.
They're again from stock I've collected over the years. The originals weren't too bad, but internally the blinker switches in particular, the indicator switches, they're the ones that suffer the most because they get used the most. And I just swapped it over for a spare that I had, and it's all working properly now. I don't intend to use it that much that it's going to be a problem, I would think, but there you go. I've got some spares that I can fix it up with if necessary. But then again, I view it, that's the way it should look. If that's the way it was originally, I can understand why someone would replace it with a more modern Japanese equivalent or whatever it happens to be, even Italian equivalent. But I've got the originals and I'm used to using them, so I keep it that way. Apart from that, most of it's pretty. As you said, I put on. It had some strange set of rear shocks on it. I had a spare set of conies that I was able to put on.
I was also going to ask, to ride it, how would you compare it to, say, the S3?
It's a lot more torquey than the S3. The S3 is the S3 engine. The 750 engines are a bit like to rev, I think, compared to these. These have got a bit more torque to them, as far as I'm concerned.
Handling and braking, is there that much difference between handling and braking? Is that much difference between
I can't say that I've noticed that much difference. It's basically the same frame. Tyres might be slightly different, but braking, everything, suspension, everything else is virtually identical on the S3 versus the Le Mans. I mean, the S3 was the first to have. That's where the 3 comes from in S3, as you know. That the 3 means the triple brakes. So Sport 750S version, which had twin discs on the front and a drum brake on the back, and then they moved to the 3. So the S3 comes out of that, and the T3 in the same way. So no, it's definitely a torquier engine. Whether it likes to, I think the S3, in my view, having ridden them for a while.
Well, I certainly recall from mine that it certainly really enjoyed revving up near the red line, and it was very smooth there.
Yes. That's the main difference I would say, is that to me, the 850 engine is torquier, although the rev limit is the same, I think, from memory. So yeah. The S3 is still in the status of being restored, so I haven't ridden it in a little while, but it'll be interesting once I do get it up and running again to do an actual side-by-side comparison.
Certainly. I think we've about covered everything.
Yes.
Just like to thank you for your time.
That's
all right. Great speaking to you.
That's okay, and great to speak to you.